so that to help to bring the peace to Yemen and to start the recovery and sustainable development. I also take this opportunity to thank the government of Kuwait as well as the government of Sweden for co-hosting this event. And this does not come from vacuum. As we know all, Kuwait did host a national dialogue between the parties to the conflict, as well as Sweden did host also lastly a dialogue in Stockholm. With this, please allow me to introduce our moderator, Nawal Al-Maghafi. She's a young journalist working with BBC as a correspondent. She has been covering extensively the conflicts in Yemen as well as in MENA region. I'll not go further on that bio for Nawal. It's very rich with all of the events, both in the MENA region as well as in Yemen. Nawal, you are most welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Abdo. Hello and welcome, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today, to see old friends and colleagues who care about Yemen, and a pleasure to be moderating this event. So welcome to you all here and to everyone who is joining us online. We're here to launch this report by UNDP, like Abdo said, the third in its series, assessing the impact of war in Yemen, pathways for recovery. I grew up in Yemen. I'm originally Yemeni, and I've been traveling there every year for the last 10 years to report for the BBC. And as a Yemeni, it's been really heartbreaking to see just how the situation has deteriorated with every trip. The conflict, I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, but the conflict has led to an urgent, widespread humanitarian and development crisis, which has resulted in significant damage to the economy, physical infrastructure, service provisions, and the health and education systems. And, we hear this time and time again, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. But what does this actually mean for Yemenis on the ground? And what it means, and I've met a lot of these people, is having to make impossible choices every single day. I've met people, families, who have had to decide between whether to take their sick child to hospital today or whether to feed the rest of their families. I've met families who have had to send their sons to the front lines, not because they believe in the cause, but because they can no longer feed them, or marry off their child daughters for that very same reason. And every day that this war continues, these choices only get harder for these families, and their reliance on emergency aid grows deeper, and the road to come back from this becomes more difficult. As I was reading the report that you all have in your hands yesterday, I thought of this woman that I met on my last trip to Yemen. Her name is Selma. I met her in a malnutrition ward in a hospital in Sana'a, and she was sat beside her severely malnourished child. And I'm sure that all of you who've watched reports on Yemen on the news have seen this image time and time again. Mothers sat beside their malnourished children, watching them withering away. I held Selma's hand, and I told her that I was really sorry that she was going through this. And, her response really took me by surprise. She was really stoic and really strong. And she said, it's okay, she'll go to a better place. And what does she have to live for here anyway? And that really stuck with me, because when I read the report, I thought of her. Because today, we aren't going to be going over how bad the situation is in Yemen. We're going to be talking about restoring hope and what we can do to actually turn things around, not just for Yemen, but most importantly, for Yemen's next generation. And we have a brilliant lineup to be talking and discussing this report with you today. We're going to be hearing from the UNDP's administrator, the event's co-host, the permanent representatives for the United Nations, Sweden and Kuwait. We'll also be hearing the thoughts of the permanent representative for Yemen, and we'll be speaking to the report's curators and have an opportunity to dissect the report with a brilliant panel. And then we'll open the floor to questions for all of you that are here joining us today, and also everyone who's watching online. So, without further ado, please welcome UNDP's Administrator, Achim Steiner.
Nawal, this may be yours or somebody else's. This is the age of COVID here, so. Nawal, thank you first of all for your opening remarks. I'm very touched by the fact that you are a journalist who has a connection to what we're going to talk about today, and often journalism is meant to be independent, neutral, objective. These are very powerful words. The question is, does one lose one's objectivity, one's neutrality, one's independence, if one actually has a link to a place? And in this instance, I'm very glad that you have agreed to moderate today, because part of the reason why we are meeting in this very same room again to release the third report is in itself a sign of collective failure. When the first report was launched on the impact of war, together with our dear colleagues at the Party Center who have been so central to this effort, and together with Auke and the country team in Yemen also, we had hoped that it would be a signal to the world to realize that the cost of this war is simply in such a set of dimensions and implications that it really should not be allowed to simply continue. Now, how often have we said that in history? Well, more often than we would wish to admit. And, today we live in an age of protracted conflicts. We have given essentially the inability of the international community, often symbolized by the United Nations, but let us also be clear, the international community is not only the UN in the sense of the Security Council or the Secretary General, it is also emblematic of an international community that is failing to succeed in bringing wars to an end. And so as we meet here together for the third of these reports, I also have a somewhat split sense of emotion, because for me it is difficult to acknowledge that these years have passed, and just in terms of recent reports again, the situation is actually getting worse in Yemen. Imagine that. Not only in terms of the immediacy of casualties, but actually in terms of the implications and impacts of war. And perhaps one of the most powerful messages I think that this report brings out more clearly than before, and Jonathan, thank you also for you and your team, is that more people actually die not because they're casualties on the battlefield, but because of the impact of war on precisely the kind of children that you just described. What this war has perhaps exemplified more than others, and that's also where these reports do matter, well beyond Yemen, is that the impact of war, the cost of war, is often untold in terms of so many things that happen well beyond the newsreel that we might see for a few days when there is a particularly horrendous moment in a conflict, or when there is a particularly intense moment of negotiation and mediation. The truth is, and I look at my dear colleague Auke, who has now spent 5 years I think it is, Auke, working as our representative in Yemen. And Auke, I want you, when you speak later, to say a couple of words also about what is it that keeps you engaged in a country like Yemen. I mean, you could have been in many other places by now. We normally do not ask our representatives to serve for such long periods in a conflict and crisis context. But it is in part also what I think brings us together here this morning, an appreciation that what is happening in Yemen to Yemeni citizens, to the future of this country, to the promise to its children, is really unfathomable. And in the context of everything that's happening around us today, the world is in danger of forgetting the millions of people in Yemen who are actually nowhere better off than they were a few years ago. Indeed, in some respects, we are seeing the numbers, and I will spare you because I think we have so many interesting speakers this morning. I will not take a lot of time to present to you some of the statistics and data because you will see it in a moment. But what I want to speak to is the logic of actually staying, and as we sometimes say in the UN, deliver. Why do we do this? And is this really a sort of failed act of solidarity? Because are we really making a difference to people? if you take the numbers, you would be justified in asking, yes, what is all the international support delivering? Humanitarian development or whatever in between forms we choose to use. And yet I would say to you, precisely because of what this report describes in terms of the impact of war, maybe you will also understand better why individuals like Auke and the dozens and dozens of colleagues who work with him in country, in fact it's more than dozens, actually continue to believe in what we're doing, not because it is the solution to war. We know that that solution lies somewhere else. But it is to stand next to people who otherwise have little left than to describe a kind of outlook which is really very painful. I let my child go on to another place. That cannot be the answer. And it cannot be the answer for the international community. It cannot be for us as the United Nations here, nor can it be for UNDP. And so we have believed deeply, and I have learned as I traveled myself to Yemen, to understand how important it can be in such a situation to not lose sight of the fact that one day the idea of development will become a real possibility again. And as you said yesterday, Auke, there are, at the moment, active combat situations in perhaps 30 of the districts, if I understand you correctly. Sorry? 50 out of 300. So here already is one reason why actually there are spaces and places in which we can work where the majority of the population lives and is trying to survive. Whether it is simply in terms of having food, some form of income, livelihood, access to health services, education, the minimum of what makes a person believe it is worth surviving to the next day, including when you are parents of children. And in the way that we have worked, and here I want to also acknowledge the World Bank, because in that partnership between the World Bank and the United Nations agencies, we have seen some new ground being broken in the way that we were able to essentially work with one another, work in complementarity to each other, and also take advantage of what the United Nations often is most admired for. That even in the most extreme circumstances, our teams stay. They find ways in which to reach people. They find ways in which those attempts to make life more livable, even in the midst of a conflict, are actually very real. And when you will hear later on about the projects, the literally millions of people that are reached through these efforts, you will also understand why bringing this report out today is both in many ways an appeal to the world to understand quite how dramatic the situation is, how deeply injured this country is in terms of its future development path, but also that there is never an end point to say there is no future. Yemen will have a future, and part of what we can do while we try and help people keep them alive in the literal sense through humanitarian support livelihoods so that they can train, develop new skills. And, just one example that may sound somewhat exotic to you, solar power. Why would solar power matter to a country like Yemen? Well, first of all, because it's electricity where there is otherwise none. This is the harsh truth. The national grids don't work. You can't afford to import diesel to run your little generators because either it's very expensive or you may not even have access to it. In the course of installing, I think it's well over 400 solar power systems, we have not only created access to electricity for hundreds of thousands of people, we've also helped to train 10,000 people who hopefully will find a future source of income in working in a solar industry that is growing in Yemen. Counterintuitive, but a good example of how in the midst of a war, you can actually build some of the stepping stones to the future. So let me end my brief remarks by, first of all, welcoming you again here, to thank the Ambassador of Sweden, the Ambassador of Yemen, the Ambassador of Kuwait, for joining us in presenting to the world a reminder that there are millions of people in the midst of a conflict who look to the international community for support because it is within their own country clearly not a resolvable situation, and nor in a regional context has it proven to be a journey that has taken us from where we had hoped in Stockholm a couple of years ago we would find ourselves today. But it is not a moment in which either the international community can turn away from Yemen, forget it in the context of many other conflicts and crises, and it is something that we as UNDP, as an integral part of the UN family active in Yemen, are totally committed to. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Achim. I think what's really cruel about Yemen's humanitarian crisis is that it is a man-made humanitarian crisis, but that also means that there is something we can do about it. It's with great pleasure that I get to introduce our next two speakers. I'd like to firstly thank them for co-hosting this event and also for providing platforms for the warring parties to have dialogue, whether in Kuwait or in Sweden. So without further ado, can you please welcome the Swedish Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Her Excellency Anna Ennerström.
Thank you very much, Nawal, and I'm really delighted to be here today, together with the colleagues from UNDP and Kuwait, and together with all the rest of you to co-host the launch of this report. I think the report is important in several ways. I mean, I agree with what Achim said, that it highlights really the urgent situation and very serious situation on the ground. And I think, like Achim said, that we need to make sure that we keep the situation in Yemen high up on our agenda. There are so many other things happening right now. There are so many other crises happening, but we need to collectively keep it high on our agenda. But I think despite that, it also gives hope and charts a path forward towards sustainable development and for a better future. But this requires peace. And here I come back to what Achim said and to the efforts that Sweden, Kuwait and others have done. We need to continue to make all the efforts we can to establish peace in Yemen. The study has also showed that we cannot work in silos, and I think this report is also showing that. We need to work with the political dialogue, the humanitarian action and long-term development, including peace building in a mutually reinforcing way. And Sweden has 3 lines of integrating efforts and priorities for Yemen. First, ending the fighting and move towards a political process. In this respect, we support various initiatives and organizations building peace from the ground up, as well as the efforts of the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Hans Grundberg, to restart a political process. And I also want to emphasize very much the full and meaningful participation of women in that process. This is an area which we have pushed very hard for from the Swedish side, and of course there is a reason for that. We need to engage 50% of the population in the peace process. Secondly, as we continue to work for a political solution, we must redouble our efforts to alleviate the humanitarian crisis. Yemen continues to be one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, and the risk of large-scale famine remains imminent. As donors, we need to step up in securing funding, and Sweden has worked jointly with the UN and with Switzerland to mobilizing resources for Yemen, and we will continue to do so. Third, we cannot wait for the future perfect moment to launch long-term development cooperation with Yemen. The deep and protracted nature of the crisis has caused needs that go far beyond the humanitarian response. The Swedish government has adopted a new development cooperation strategy for the Middle East and North Africa region, and for the first time, the strategy has a specific focus on peaceful development in Yemen. The strategy includes support to peace building, human rights, and access to basic services and sustainable development. Sweden remains a long-term engaged partner with Yemen, and my Minister for Foreign Affairs has visited Yemen several times, as well as the region. We have staff both from the Foreign Ministry and for the Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, frequently visiting the country for dialogue and follow-up of our development cooperation. I'm very happy today to be accompanied here today with our special envoy for Yemen, Peter Semneby, who is sitting in the audience, and he's actively working to tying the various strands together. Let me end by yet again extending our appreciation to UNDP, to the researcher, for providing us with this report. We look forward to the recommendations and how we can promote peace and recovery in Yemen. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Can we please welcome His Excellency Mansour Al-Utaibi, the Permanent Representative for Kuwait.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your opening remarks and for the comments you made that this is indeed a man-made crisis, and we all know that the worst crisis is the man-made crisis, unfortunately. And Achim, regarding your comments, I couldn't agree more about the humanitarian situation in Yemen, and I believe this report is another reminder for the international community that they should do more. So let me start by saying it gives me really a great pleasure to be here this morning at the Japan Society to launch alongside the permanent mission of Sweden and with many friends and colleagues the UNDP's third and final report on the state of development in post-conflict Yemen and how much state is impacting the ways in which everyday Yemenis live, interact, and behave. Before I begin, let me thank the UNDP and Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver for all that they have done over the past period in bringing together different statistics, predictions, realities into this publication. Though some numbers mentioned may be unfortunate and quite shocking. This third UNDP report, which comes after two very important reports published in early and late 2019, acknowledges the importance of redevelopment, economic restimulation, the need for all parties to engage, negotiate, and indulge within the political process to halt and end the current humanitarian catastrophe. The physical infrastructure of Yemen, service provision, health and education system, as the report highlights, have all been damaged as a result of the conflict. It is for that reason, and of course, in fact, more importantly, for the humanitarian aspects that we in Kuwait have been calling all political parties to engage in the political process. In this regard, I cannot but reinforce once again our commitment and support to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General of Yemen. He's also Swedish. In his effort to resolve the situation, I would furthermore like to reinforce the importance of implementing all related Security Council resolution, and in particular Resolution 2216. The implementation mechanism also of the initiative of the Gulf Cooperation Council, as well as the outcomes of the Yemeni National Dialogue Conference, and welcome all international initiatives and plans that target stabilizing the situation in Yemen, like Saudi Arabia's peace plan. We also acknowledge the right of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to defend itself against any and all attacks. We, moreover, ask the international community to incorporate the legitimate government in Yemen to help the Yemeni state rebuild its infrastructure, and provide the essential everyday services the people of Yemen want: security, safety, school, hospitals, a growing economy, a dignified job, and that is what we have always wanted and called for. As for Kuwait, the Kuwait's efforts in helping Yemen stabilize the humanitarian situation, this hasn't begun recently. In fact, Kuwait has, in the 70s, played a vital role in stabilizing relations between the South and the North. Officials shuttling between cities, villages, and strengthen Yemeni dialogue. That's who we are, more recently, we have welcomed all political parties in Kuwait for almost 4 straight months in 2016, with the aim of having all parties engage in a direct manner, resolve their differences, and come up with solutions. Needless to note that financial contributions that Kuwait did give to help ease the humanitarian situation since 2015, though mostly channeled through the multiple agencies of the United Nations, and which have exceeded an overall amount of $350 million, did not differentiate between the regions and diverse people of Yemen. On another yet similar note, the Kuwait Fund for Arab Economic Development has since 1968, given more than 158 million Kuwaiti dinars, or more than $500 million as a loan and grants to support more than 35 different developmental projects. Again, the report that we have today highlights how important it is to focus on development, stabilize the broad situation, focus on the economy, strengthen the infrastructure, and build schools and hospitals, work on achieving the SDGs. In conclusion, I would like to thank again the UNDP and Joseph Corporal School of International Studies for publishing this report that we are launching today. Yemen needs the support of everyone, of the international community, as Achim said, of the United Nations, and all humanitarian assistance given to Yemen should also have a development-oriented aspects for the people of Yemen. And in the cause of sustainability, need that today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Like you said, Yemen really does need the support of the international community, and Kuwait and Sweden have really played a leading role. Before we delve into the report's findings from the principal investigator, please welcome to the stage His Excellency Abdullah Al-Saadi, the permanent representative for Yemen in the United Nations.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you, my sister Nawal Al-Maghafi, for your opening remarks. And I would like also to thank Director of UNDP, my sister also, PR of Sweden, and my brother, Mansour Atibi, PR of Kuwait. Allow me at the outset to express my sincere gratitude to the state of Kuwait, Kingdom of Sweden, and UNDP for co-hosting these events. I would like to also thank the authors of this insightful report for their efforts on behalf of Yemen. The war has indeed left a huge impact on development in Yemen, derailing the achievement of past and complicating the plans for the future, since identifying the root causes and effects of any issue is crucial for properly addressing it. There is a need for awareness and understanding the conflict's repercussions on development in Yemen before commencing the plans of reconstruction and recovery. Today's report presents a significant addition to the efforts of Build Back Better, while harnessing construction to serve as a foundation block for achieving the Sustainable Development Agenda. To that end, the trilogy series of study is quite timely and important. Allow me in this regard to highlight 3 main points. Firstly, peace is key to development. Achieving a comprehensive, peaceful solution through UN-led peace process is only the way to end the current conflict, alleviating the humanitarian suffering, and allow for the full economic and development recovery, in order to ensure that all parties can work together to make the Yemeni people common aspiration into reality. prevent new cycle of conflict and eventually bring Yemen back on track to achieving the SDGs. Such a peaceful solution will have to be based on the three main references: the GCC initiative and its implementation mechanism, the outcome of the National Dialogue Conference, the relevant UN Security Council resolution, in particular Resolution 2216. The government of Yemen has been and continue to be committed to a peaceful solution, which has demonstrated on multiple occasions. The government has publicly welcomed all peace and ceasefire initiatives and proposals. Most recently, we welcomed the UN Secretary General calls for ceasefire and engage constructively to implement the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia initiatives, which call for a comprehensive ceasefire, reopening the Sana'a International Airport, and the further facilitate access to Hudaida seaport in accordance with the Stockholm agreements, and the resumption of the peace process. Meanwhile, the Houthi militias, as usual, have rejected all these initiatives, all these proposals, and continue their aggressions on multiple fronts, including on Marib, a governorate that represents of the last safe havens for millions IDPs. The attack of Houthis in Marib threatened to derail the political process and will severely hamper all efforts to move towards achieving sustainable peace. Secondly, rebuilding institutions and human capital go hand in hand with reconstruction efforts in the journey to sustainable recovery. Indeed, the many economic and social programs in Yemen have played a major role in mitigating the impact of war, yet the fact remains that on top of the devastating damage to physical infrastructures, the conflict has significantly weakened state institutions and forced millions of qualified Yemenis to leave the country. Hence, it must be highlighted that the role of the national and local institutions is crucial to ensuring a sustainable recovery, strengthening the public and private institutions, including through effective capacity building programs to compensate for the economic and human toll of the war is imperative to prevent conflict recurrence. We urge the international community to extend their support to the government of Yemen to rehabilitate the vital sectors and services. In this regard, we commend the great work of UNDP and UNDP team in Yemen and urge them to further extend their coordination with the relevant government authorities. Thirdly, recovery should not start when the war ends. It must start now. While it's important to address the urgent humanitarian priorities, we must not lose sight of the opportunity to integrate development aspects into all humanitarian operations in Yemen. This approach should enable us to close the widening humanitarian gap, while at the same time pave the way for achieving the SDGs. This development approach should also create incentives for stakeholders to prioritize peace and loosen the grip of warlords on the economy. More importantly, it should help save the dignity of the Yemeni people who take pride of their work and independence. On the same context, allow me to echo and quote what ASG Dr. Khalida said in her foreword to this report. We know that an inclusive development approach is not only the foundation, but a prerequisite for lasting peace, and that there can be no peace without development. In conclusion, peace and development are two faces of the same coin. They depend on each other for sustainability. The government of Yemen is sparing no efforts to achieve both, and it stands ready to work with partners to push the peace process forward to sustain development, while prioritizing development to achieve peace. The government of Yemen will diligently consider this series of reports, in particular when designing development and recovery strategies for the country. Despite the difficulties, humanitarian, economic difficulties, Yemen remains the most beautiful country that has cultural and civilized history, and we hope the peace will prevail in Yemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency Abdullah Saadi. And I completely agree with you. Yemen is one of the most beautiful countries, and we'll be seeing a video that shows you some of that beauty later on today. And we'll also be hearing from Dr. Khalida Bouzar later in the event. But next, we're actually going to delve into the report and hear from one of the principal investigators who worked on this report, Dr. Jonathan D. Moyer. Please welcome him, the director of the Pardee Center for International Futures.
Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jonathan Moyer, and I bring greetings from the University of Denver, the Korbel School of International Studies, and the Pardee Center for International Futures. I'd like to acknowledge some of my co-authors in this work. The lead author of this report, Taylor Hanna, is with us today, and Dave Bohl, who's another author, is not. Today, I'm going to present findings from a series of 3 reports. Each of these reports dives into the question of the developmental costs of conflict in Yemen. The first report assessed the actual cost of conflict using a new set of methodologies that allowed us to look at multidimensional dynamics associated with how conflict affects development, including issues related to poverty, malnutrition, economic development, infrastructure development, health, etc. The second report dove further into the question of how has the conflict affected Yemen's ability to achieve the SDGs, and is it possible to provide developmental assistance during conflict that significantly changes the developmental trajectory? We found that it's not, and that ending the conflict is the only viable path forward for changing the developmental trajectory of Yemen in a significant way. The conflict has set back development in Yemen by over 2 decades, and that is what led us to the final report, which I think is both hopeful and also cautionary. On the hopeful side, we explore pathways forward for a recovery scenario for Yemen in a post-conflict environment. We're not providing a policy roadmap with specific actions for actors to take, but instead a strategic framework to think about and to help policymakers understand trade-offs and synergies in the pursuit of different policies and their effect on human development. On the cautionary side, we update our findings. The previous report looked at the cost of conflict in Yemen through 2019 and projected that through 2030. We've now updated that through 2021. The findings from this are that the cost of conflict in Yemen continues to be very high. In fact, as the conflict proceeds, the cost increases. And I'll highlight some of those costs in detail for you all. Next, we reinforce the finding that ending the conflict is the only viable path forward to change the development trajectory of Yemen. After this, I'll present findings that show that the post-conflict recovery space is something we have to consider carefully as an international community. Development goals in recovery should target development trajectories prior to conflict. What that means is that prior to the escalation of conflict in 2015, there was a trajectory that Yemen was on. We argue that in order to set a just and reasonable development target for Yemen in a post-conflict space, we should target that previous development trajectory so that the future generation of Yemenis do not have to suffer all of the developmental costs of the conflict. We argue also that recovery in that conflict space requires an integrated and coordinated approach across both issue areas and actors. And by that we mean we need people to coordinate, actors on the ground, at the regional and international level, so that investments in Yemen are not made capriciously, they're made strategically, and from a perspective of long-term development strategies and opportunities. The cost of the conflict is high. Updating the figures for 2021, we estimate that the conflict has caused 377,000 deaths. Of those 377,000 deaths, 223,000 are indirect. That means people dying from lack of access to food, lack of access to income, infrastructure, water, and sanitation, not directly in fighting. 60% of the deaths are indirect. 60% are not caused by conflict directly. Every 9 minutes in 2021, a child under 5 dies indirectly due to conflict. When we estimated this in 2019, it was every 12 minutes. So that's becoming more of a significant cost across time. The cumulative loss to GDP is quite high. The number of additional people living in extreme poverty is more than 15 million, driven by conflict. The number of additional people in malnutrition is high as well, more than 8 million. These numbers I'm showing you, it's important to understand that they are conflict attributable numbers. So they're not the total number of people living in poverty or the total number of people living with undernutrition. They're the portion of that population that we argue is attributable directly to the conflict across time. I'll explain more. So the 2021 column shows the costs up through 2021, and through 2030, you get a sense of, if the conflict continues, how these developmental impacts change. And it gets worse. The longer the conflict continues, it gets worse. Very brief note on methodology. I know many people are not here for the methodology section of the presentation. We use a tool called International Futures, which is an integrated assessment model. We have a long-standing partnership with UNDP, and we greatly value and appreciate the leadership of UNDP. We've benefited significantly from this relationship. It helps to refine our research, and we hope that we can help refine your policy implementation and advocacy. The tool is a kind of model called an integrated assessment model, which means you're looking at macro-level development trends within and across development systems. So how does demography change? And how does demography interact with economics? How do these interact with education, health, infrastructure, conflict, governance, etc.? You're trying to simulate development across all of these systems for all the countries of the world. The scenarios that we analyze here, so now we're moving into thinking about how are we doing this post-conflict recovery analysis. We start with a conflict scenario, which looks at a continuation of conflict in Yemen between 2015 and 2030. Next, we create a no-conflict scenario, which simulates a development trajectory that Yemen would have been on in the absence of conflict. This is very important. This is what we argue should be the international community's benchmark for thinking about post-conflict recovery in Yemen. Next, we look at recovery alternatives. So first, there's a fragmented recovery scenario, which looks at recovery in Yemen, but it's a tenuous situation. The political settlement is weak, there's a high likelihood of reverting back into conflict, and development reflects those uncertainties. Next, we create building blocks of recovery. These are alternative policy strategies that can be pursued that focus on issues like women empowerment, agriculture, education, health, infrastructure. What effects do each of these strategies have on improving or changing human development outcomes? Finally, we pulled together what we think is an optimistic but realistic and possible development recovery scenario for Yemen, and I'll show you the outcomes of that later in this presentation. To give you a sense, this is how we treat conflict attributable numbers. So I'm going to show you a few graphs, and I'll try to describe what's in each graph so they're understandable. Here you have two scenarios, a conflict scenario, which is the line that's growing across time, and a no conflict scenario for total deaths in Yemen from 2014 to 2021. The no conflict scenario, you see a slight increase in deaths in Yemen. That's a slightly aging population, right? This is a slightly growing population. But in the conflict scenario, you see this significant increase in mortality. The difference between those two is the conflict attributable mortality. That's how we calculate the 377,000 people who have died through 2021. There's a lot that goes in behind that, and the Party Center has a large team of researchers. Happy to talk to you individually if you'd like to know more. Let's get into the findings. I'm going to show a couple graphs for a couple scenarios to give you a sense of how to think about the developmental costs of conflict. On mortality on the left, so it's the number of deaths from 2014 to 2030, and on the right, it's GDP, so it's total economic output for the country. Both of these scenarios are the conflict scenarios, so deaths increase and the GDP doesn't change very much. When we add in the fragmented recovery scenario, so a scenario of recovery with a tenuous piece, where the possibility of backsliding into conflict is very high, a very common characteristic of post-conflict states. You can see that the mortality effects of that are to reduce the mortality. So we save lives in a fragmented recovery. The number of lives we save is about 440,000 between 2021 and 2030. Peace is the only viable answer, right? Though peace is not sufficient. On the GDP side of things, you can see the GDP increases as well. When we compare these with no conflict development trajectories, this is what we believe is the optimal, or what should be the international community's target for development in Yemen. You can see that there are still a large number of indirect deaths from conflict, even in a peace and recovery scenario. And that's because the development trajectory of Yemen has not returned to the pre-conflict trajectory. So actually, while we save lives in Yemen, it's about 440,000 in a fragmented recovery. The number of lives that are still lost in that period is greater, 500,000 lives. So even in recovery, we're still not doing what we think we should be in order to bring a just development situation to Yemen. On top of this fragmented scenario, we look at these alternative building blocks, okay? These are outlined in much more detail in the report, so I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but we're looking generally at governance, how effective is the state, human capabilities, things like education and health, infrastructure, empowered women, what effects does greater participation of women in labor and leadership and education for girls, what effects do they have on development? Agricultural investments, as we all know, Yemen is a net importer of food. Food security issues are profound. And economic development, looking at increases in investment, productivity, and aid and remittances. What are the effects of these? This bar graph is showing you the additional lives saved in 2030 and through 2050 of each of these additional building block scenarios. You can see something like human capabilities has a small effect at saving lives in the short term. Investing in education is a long-term prospect. It's very important to do, but it's a long-term effort, and it has more of an effect through 2050. The largest single intervention in the building block recovery scenarios is an empowered women scenario. Empowering and including women in governance, in the economy, and in the way society works in Yemen has the most profound effect in a post-conflict space at changing the development recovery pattern, especially when you're looking at lives saved. What about an integrated recovery? What if we bring together and coordinate efforts across Yemen, the region, and the globe in order to be strategic about how we're making investments? Not investments for giant infrastructure projects, but investments for human development, which include infrastructure, but also things that are softer, like governance quality, right? Also things that are fundamentally important, like female empowerment within the society. The effect of that is transformative for Yemeni development. Tens of millions fewer in poverty and malnutrition, 710,000 fewer deaths relative to a scenario with conflict. These are all through 2030, and a much larger GDP. The effect of the integrated recovery on the lives saved is to save many more lives than any of the individual building blocks. It's not additive, right? It's not all the building blocks create the same sum. There are trade-offs when you look at different development priorities and strategies. This is the final graph, and then I have one more conclusion slide, and then I'll be done. This graph shows GDP per capita for Yemen across all of the different recovery and no conflict scenarios. It doesn't show the conflict scenario, which would be very low across the bottom. So we're looking at more optimistic trajectories for Yemen. What's possible with Yemeni development across time? The integrated recovery pathway takes Yemen from a conflict development trajectory to a pre-conflict development trajectory and then some. It represents a transformative way of thinking about how the international, regional, and local key actors can integrate their efforts and promote development across multiple dimensions within the country to achieve the level of development that Yemen would have seen in the absence of conflict. I believe this is essential for the next generation of Yemenis, and I believe it's our obligation to pursue this kind of development objective. Final slide. Recommendations. You have an advocacy responsibility, I would argue. The cost of conflict is too high. I've talked for probably more than 9 minutes, which is the amount of time it takes for one child in Yemen to die of conflict who's younger than 5 years in 2021. So please advocate for the cost of conflict. That's an important starting point. But that's not where we end. We have to prioritize a sustainable and lasting peace deal. I think everyone agrees that this is essential. Getting there will require effort. We need to promote an integrated recovery plan, which requires coordination, and I would say requires international organizations to step outside of their silos. International organizations can be siloed at times, and I think our research shows that stepping outside of your silos, finding ways to coordinate strategically and invest in ways that are designed not to be capricious and atomized, but are designed to be holistic is very important. And finally, invest in a post-conflict recovery with the goal of future generations of Yemenis, right? Target a pre-conflict development trajectory for evaluating the success of a post-conflict scenario. So with that, I want to thank you all for your attention. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to present this research, and I do hope that we can make a significant impact positively on the future generations of Yemenis. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that comprehensive explanation of the report. I really urge all of you here today and everyone watching online to read it. It's a sophisticated piece of work. It's really an interesting read. And I just want to remind everyone that, some of the numbers you mentioned are really sobering. And it's really important for us to remember that they aren't just numbers. We're talking about real people here and real families that are being affected by this. We really couldn't have a better panel to be discussing this report today. So please welcome them onto the stage. We're going to be speaking to Auka Lautsma, who is the UNDP's resident representative in Yemen, Peter Salisbury, who is the senior analyst for the International Crisis Group, and Amal Nasser, who's an economist for the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. So join me on the stage. Okay, so I'm going to start with you, Auka, and I hope I'm saying your name right. So, you've been on the ground now for over 5 years, am I right in saying? And, the situation has changed dramatically over the last 5 years, and we've just heard from Jonathan. But from your point of view, how has it changed? What have you seen? And why is it so important for us to take action now?
Thank you. Let me start off actually by answering a question with a personal story. Achim, you asked me why am I still doing this, right? And let me start off with my father. My father is still alive, luckily enough, and he's been a sailor all his life. And I was the firstborn child, so when, I was born, I was practically born on a ship, and we were sailing the world. I've seen many countries, although I don't remember. My mother was the cook. In those days, ships were much smaller than today. So I've traveled many, many countries. But nothing could prepare me for UNDP. This is not a joke, by the way.
And UNDP in Yemen as well.
Yeah, so I'll come to the point, I promise you. I joined UNDP in 1994, and for those of you old enough, you remember this is the year of genocide in Rwanda. So soon enough, I was sent off to Rwanda, and indeed, nothing could prepare me for what I experienced, what I saw in Rwanda at the time. The cruelty, the misery, the poverty, But at the same time, this was also the moment where I realized, this is what I'm born to do. So this is my answer to you, Achim. So nothing can stop me from doing this because I feel this is my calling in life. And I'm not meaning this in a sort of superficial way, but that's how I felt it at the time, and still that's how I feel about it today. So now, coming to your point, Nawal, talking about Yemen, 5 years indeed is a long time. And from the moment the war started, of course, the humanitarian situation was at the center of the international attention, but also at the people's mind to how to address, the suffering of the Yemeni people. So over these 5 years, on the one hand, nothing has changed, right? If you look at the humanitarian response plan for 2021 or 2022, we still see the same numbers coming up in terms of people who are in need of humanitarian assistance, people who need to be fed by WFP, despite the fact that, we call Yemen the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and it has received, as a matter of fact, enormous amounts of humanitarian assistance over this time. The largest number of beneficiaries, but also the largest sums of humanitarian aid. So in that sense, we're still at the same point of where we were before, a couple of years ago. At the same time, I think what we've also seen is that somehow, over time, Yemen has also become the worst development crisis in the world. And I think this is a fact that the report tries to underscore and which is not recognized enough in the world. That also means our response in the absence of peace, but hopefully also when a settlement is there in the aftermath of the peace settlement, that our response also has to change. And therefore, right now we already need to change to, tackle more the deep-rooted, deep-seated development problems and the structural development deficits that Yemen has. Think about food security. Think about the water scarcity. Yeah? Yemen is one of the most water scarce countries in the world as we speak, and it's getting worse every day. We talked about gender, and I think Jonathan powerfully demonstrated that if we invest more in gender, in women, that it could make a huge difference in the country right now, as a matter of fact. We don't need to wait until a settlement has come. So I think, in my estimation, one, there is a need for change. I also feel there is a change actually happening. The conversation in the international community, but also in Yemen, about how we can work better together as the humanitarian community, the development community, but also the political community to come back with more coherent, more coordinated responses in Yemen. Also because we are requested to do more with less, right? And I think we really come up a point now where we actually have to make somehow, how to operationalize this will be the biggest question that will come in front of us. But I feel that over time, at least we have come to the realization that something needs to change also in our attitude as international community vis-a-vis, addressing the problems in Yemen.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to build on that point you made about what Jonathan said about the impact female empowerment will have on Yemen's development. Like, that really took me aback seeing that on the screen. And so I want to go on to you, Emel. What steps could be taken by the international community, do you think, to empower women to support the integrated economy? And I'm not asking you this because you're a woman, but because I know you've done a lot of work on this. What can they do?
A lot. The idea is like His Excellency Saadi said that we should start thinking about recovery now. And I know that we have this motto, Yemen can't wait, and we need to take action. And I think in the case of Yemen, Yemen needs us to take action, not today, but yesterday, okay? So in order to support women empowerment in this recovery plan, I believe that the international community, if we're talking about the international community, should support more like gender inclusive and women inclusive reconstruction plans. And when I say gender inclusive, I don't mean that I go to many places where I'm the only woman in the room, and that's not gender inclusion. We need to see more women amplify women voices more, and across ages and generations, not just like you have senior leadership and so on, but you have to listen. You have a very young population in Yemen. Big portion of them are young girls, as we have seen here in the beautiful picture. And we need to listen to them and amplify their voices. On the other hand, if we're talking about local authorities, we need to see also steps from the government to empower women. And it's not okay to say to see people in high-level positions that are only men, or a government without any women representation. We're not advocating for quotas or just representation of the sake of representation, but it does have an effect on a wider range of women to have their voices heard and see themselves represented by other women and have their ideas also brought to decision makers and policy makers, and to see some gradual change in that regard. So it goes hand in hand by the international community and also the Yemeni government to empower women to reach this, like Jonathan said, optimistic, but yet it is still doable, this integrated recovery in Yemen.
Thank you. And Peter, I think one of the things that everyone's mentioned today is how important peace is for us to move forward. The impact the conflict has had over the last 6 years has been staggering. And I know you've been following what's happening. How viable is a peace settlement anytime soon? Give us some hope, please.
Unfortunately, that's probably not what I'm here to do today. There are two things that we've all, I think, said since the beginning of the conflict. The first is that there is no military solution to this war, that no party can prevail militarily, and that the only way to end it is through a political settlement that is in some way, shape, or form acceptable to all sides, all parties to the conflict. And unfortunately, over the last year and a half, what we've seen is a context in which one party in particular, the Houthis, now believes that there is a viable military path to victory. And victory in this context doesn't mean total control of the country overnight. It means winning the war for the north of Yemen by taking Marib city and nearby oil and gas resources, by locking in those resources and making its economic model more sustainable, and by dealing an additional blow to the internationally recognized government. And if the Houthis succeed in this, I think we will enter into a new phase of conflict, which is much more complex, and we'll see realignments among the various anti-Houthi groups on the ground that will make political mediation even more challenging in the medium term. And unfortunately, at this moment in time, there are very few incentives for the Houthis to stop their offensive on Marib, and there are very few diplomatic opportunities for negotiation. And it does appear that the Houthis are in effect warding off diplomacy of any kind until they can reach some sort of final resolution, as it were, for Marib, which would be an extremely bloody battle if it enters the city and would cause a displacement crisis within a displacement crisis. So I'm not fantastically optimistic about the opportunities for peace. And if this battle does take place, I do think we're going to see further fragmentation, further political challenges on the ground that make, for example, some of these scenarios knottier to grapple with when we think about who might be the authorities that you have to deal with, authorities plural, and not just one or two, but multiple authorities on the ground, each proclaiming their own legitimacy, then with sort of additional factors internationally. So I think we have a long and challenging path ahead of us in Yemen, unfortunately.
Thank you for that, Peter. I'd like to open up to the floor for questions, and also for everyone who is watching us online. You can send your questions through on Zoom, and I'll make sure we put them forward to our panel. You can also ask questions to Jonathan about the report if you have any. I'll let you guys think about your questions for a minute, but before that, I mean, Peter, just going back to what you were saying, you know, both of us lived in Yemen and worked in Yemen before and during the war. What do you see as the biggest changes in that time, both in general and to the economy?
I mean, it's hard to list out the number of changes that you see. And of course, Yemen is a really heterogeneous country. So you spend time in Aden, it's very different than spending time in Sana'a, and so on and so forth. But what I will say is, between 2018 and 2019, I didn't get into the country very much. And then, 2017 and 18, at the end of 2018, I got to the Red Sea coast while they were fighting there. And I went to buy some bottles of water, which is a pretty normal, basic task, and got into a fight with the guy at the Dukhan. An argument, I don't mean a physical fight, because he wanted to charge me 1,000 riyals for 4 bottles of water. And I said, look, I know I'm not from around here, but we both know that isn't the price. And what I hadn't, of course, calculated was it had been a year and a half. That was the price. And the story that I hear on a day-to-day basis from everybody I speak to, regardless of where they are in the country, is that for the first few years of the war, the fundamental challenge was this de-development, was the lack of economic activity and opportunity. And now we have this additional crisis of just the spiraling cost of living, where we've seen the cost of the WFP monitored food basket doubling. And everyone I speak to in Yemen now, all they want to talk to, especially in the south and east of the country, is that the cost of living is simply unbearable and unsurvivable. And if you spend time outside of the country, it's these little things that when you go back in, that you suddenly notice, you realize just sort of how fundamentally the cost of living has changed. But those 1,000 riyals, no one's getting paid an extra 3,000 riyals to make up for the difference compared to the beginning of the war.
Yeah, it's really sad. I've seen the same. I mean, with people wanting to buy milk for their children, not being able to afford it, and it costs more to buy a pot of formula in Yemen than it does in London, in a supermarket. So it's really shocking. I've got a question here from Kasir, and this is for you, Auka. Do you normally involve young people in decision making in terms of their recovery and peace negotiations in Yemen? Yeah. Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it is important to acknowledge that Yemen has an extremely young population. Like in many Arab countries, I think the great majority of Yemenis are actually under 35. So the youth bulge, as such, is already enormous, right? So at the same time, as Peter explained, the lack of economic opportunities, of course, is hitting the youth in particular also very hard. So for us, when we develop projects to help Yemenis to survive and bring money into their pockets so that they can afford at least a minimum food basket, it is extremely important to work with youth and somehow provide them income opportunities in order to do so. So for us, working with youth in Yemen is therefore absolutely critical and 100% unavoidable at the same time, because this is the productive group that we can still work with. Because unfortunately, the case in Yemen is also that a large portion of the population is not in a good shape. They've now gone through 5 years of malnutrition, all sorts of epidemics, the biggest cholera outbreak in the world, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the productivity as a whole is at an all-time low. And working with youth is also helping us to really keep at least a minimum economy going. And therefore, working with youth, both in terms of being beneficiaries of our programs, but also working with youth in terms of deciding, what are the priorities and how can we target, the assistance that we do provide in the best way possible, is absolutely critical.
Thank you for that, Auka. Emil, I have a question for you. We have a comment that's been sent in talking about how the situation has changed for women in Yemen, how it's become more difficult. They're saying, now women are having to have a mahram. Aid workers, female aid workers have to have a mahram wherever they go. Some have to take a 10-year-old child as a mahram, and women are always harassed at checkpoints. And I can speak to that personally in Yemen, and I'm sure you can too. Yeah. So tell us and tell our audience a bit about that. How has it become more difficult for women over the last couple of years, and what more can be done to support them?
Well, you have 7 years of conflict. Surely things have changed dramatically for women in the country. You have more and more social restrictions, as we have said, with the mahram asking for a guardian through checkpoints. So there is basically freedom of mobility was never that great for women inside the country, but it got more and more restrictive with time. But we're talking about like traveling is a luxury right now in Yemen. But we can talk also about other restrictions on women that impact their livelihoods, okay? You have a lack of security for women to commute to work. And this also contributed to women being pushed out of the labor market, okay, indirectly, so to say. But you have also direct exclusion of women in the labor market, as many businesses had to downsize and so on throughout the conflict, and their first target was to lay off women, because there is this general perception that women are not breadwinners for their families, and you have to prioritize jobs for males in families. But numbers have shown that even like within IDP households, you have almost like 1/3 of them are being headed by women. And you have seen that more and more women have the burden of providing for their families, but the conditions on the ground are very restrictive and limiting for women to seek job opportunities or like mobility in their own professions. It has been also stated in the report that we have one of the lowest, if not, I guess, the lowest labor force participation rate for women in Yemen at 6%. And this data is kind of outdated because I think it goes to pre-conflict time, 2015 or 2014, and you can imagine how low this percentage is right now. On the other hand, you have more and more women entering the informal labor market to seek some kind of a livelihood or source of income, but this is also very problematic because you have an informal economy completely unregulated in best case scenarios, but within a conflict zone, so it's a perfect environment for further exploitation of women. So this effect is kind of more of a double effect on women in the country. So we can talk also about all these social restrictions, but you have economic restrictions on women that can affect their chances of also like being more independent and exercising more, I would say, visibility in public spaces and show other women that they can be empowered and they can participate in decision making and carry out change in the country.
And they really can. I mean, most of the films that I've done in Yemen have had some incredible women at the forefront.
Sure.
And it hasn't been intentional. It's just, when we've looked at the malnutrition, cholera, etc., there have been some incredible women at the forefront of resolving those crises. So if anyone has a question here, please put your hand up and we'll get a mic to you. I think we have a question from the lady at the back. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Olivia Callis from the UK mission. Thanks to all the panelists and to our host today for such an important discussion and such a depressing, I'm afraid, discussion, but so important that we all focus on this. I had a question with regards to something that Auke mentioned, that we need to do more with less and do a better job at bringing together the humanitarian development and kind of political strands. And I'd be interested to hear a bit more on how coherence and coordination on that area can help us to better address some of these devastating impacts. Of course, as colleagues here in New York know, the UN and diplomatic missions have been working hard for years on these reforms, whether it's the peace building or the development system reforms, on the normative framework. But I think this is a good opportunity to hear about what difference this actually makes on the ground. Thank you.
Should I take it?
Yes,
yeah?
please.
I'll take it away. Okay. Thank you very much, Olivia. And we go back a very long time. So thanks for participating today. I'll give you an example. I think this is the best way kind of, to showcase how this actually could work. I mentioned in another comment that the food security situation in Yemen, we have not been able to make a dent effectively, despite all this capital that we have invested in a humanitarian response, right? So basically, as we're speaking today, we still have 13 million people who are dependent on food aid provided by WFP. We also made the point that, the issue in Yemen about food security and malnutrition and ultimately famine is not about availability of food. It's about food affordability. It's a different concept. And therefore, the income side, but also the cost side of food play an extremely important role in Yemen. Now, our normal response is, we up the ante, we provide more money to WFP, to FAO, and to UN, and just keep going, right? But every year, the same number of people are still in need of food assistance. It hasn't changed anything. So on the one hand, you can say that, we have averted the famine, but on the other hand, we also did not make a dent in, getting people out of acute malnutrition. So what I'm saying here is that if you look at this a little bit more comprehensively, and for example, look at the cost structure of food. Why is food so expensive in Yemen? Because 90% of food is imported at the moment because of lack of local, possibilities in terms of local agriculture, but also, for example, transport cost. So transport costs in Yemen make 50% of the cost price of wheat in the market. So if you unpack that, what are these transport costs made of or comprised of, right? It's basically shipping cost, demurrage cost, and insurance cost of food. So if you look into that, you see that actually the ineffectiveness, the inefficiencies of the ports play a very important role. Also, the insurance premiums that are charged to importers of food are extravagant, right? So basically, importers of food pay 16 times the normal rates of insurance in Yemen, which are called war risk insurance premiums, as a matter of fact. So if we, as an international community, can actually address some of these issues, the inefficiencies in the port, the charging of war risk insurance premiums, and there are solutions for that, right? I mean, it's not something that are outside of our reach. I mean, we have successful examples of how this has happened in the past. We can actually make a dent in this, lowering the cost of food, make it more affordable for Yemenis and so on. But that will require, a collaboration between not only us on the ground as humanitarian or development actors, but also the political actors that have something to say about that, and working together towards these sort of comprehensive solutions. It's a very simple example, but it has a huge impact because rather than spending more money on humanitarian aid, we could actually save more than $250 million worth of taxpayers' money, that is now paid to the insurance industry in London. I'm not picking on you as a British, but I'm just saying that we're making Lloyd's and Company in London very rich. And when I spoke to Lloyd's about it, they were not even hiding it. They were saying simply that, Yemen is our best country in terms of making profit. I mean, in the current circumstances in Yemen, this is a crazy situation. I mean, we have to do something about it, which requires, we need to work with the Bank of England and with Lloyd's and so on and so forth to address some of these issues, that can easily be done. The government of Yemen, as a matter of fact, I'm looking at you, Ambassador, before the war had established an insurance guarantee fund, basically to offset these war risk insurance premiums after the bombing of the USS Cole and the Limburger tanker. So why not do that again? Because basically what it would mean is for an investment that doesn't even amount to an expense of $15 million, we can save $250 million, off the bat, just like that. So I do think there are solutions, but we need to first of all think out of the box. Number two, look for alliances that are not sort of natural to our normal existence, in a country as a UN system as a normal response. But if we reach a little bit out of our comfort zone, but also to the partners we don't normally deal with, actually, there are solutions, even if you have less money at your disposal. So that's what I meant with doing more with less.
Thank you for that, Auke, and thank you for your question, Olivia. I know we have a question from the gentleman there at the back, but before I go on to you, I just want to address two of these questions we got from online, give you two time to think about it. So this one's for Emel. In terms of currency devaluation in the south compared to the north, what can UN donors do to stop such deterioration? And for you, Peter, what roles can tribes play for possible peace? I thought, they need thinking about, so I'd give you them while we hear the rest of the questions. Please, the gentleman in the back, if we can please get him a microphone, and then I'll come to you.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Good morning, and thank you for the invite, and congratulations to the authors of the report in UNDP. My name is Ajay, and I work in the mediation support unit of the DPPA as a senior advisor on the ceasefire and security arrangements. So my question or a comment is basically on this pathway for recovery. Recovery is important, development is important, but development is very closely integrated with governance. Now, who governs and how is something which international community always is judgmental about. So if we are looking at a scenario in Yemen wherein we have a dispensation in Sana'a or in some place which is not to the liking of the international community or some segments of the international community. So how is such a situation avoidable, and what is going to be the international community's approach towards this pathway for recovery, which needs to take a strategic orientation if it has to go a little long term. Right now, what agencies, funds, programs are doing is doing things at operational subsistence level, and while the conflict is still raging, peacemaking is happening. And if some kind of a quasi-peace is made, and then who governs and how, as we are watching in Afghanistan. So where do we land up there, and what is the view of the panel on that? So just a kind of a comment and a question.
So who governs and how after we reach recovery? I feel like that's a very big question for this event, but I will give the panelists an opportunity to take a stab at it if they'd like to. Anyone want to take a stab at that question? I think it's a really big question for this panel, but thank you for bringing it up and giving us something to think about. So over to you first, Peter. What can the tribes do for us to reach a peaceful solution and, get to a point where we think about who governs and how?
Yeah, and I think those are somewhat interconnected questions. And the word tribe can mean different things to different people. And in Yemen, tribal structures and the role of the tribe varies from different part of the country to different part of the country. And what I'd say is maybe the better word to be using is sort of local communities and political structures. How can they play a role in peace building? And that feeds into this broader question of who governs and how in a post-conflict settlement. Because at the moment, one of the small glimmers of light we've seen during the conflict is that some local authorities, some local groups, NGOs, coming from the ground up, have done incredibly fantastic work on absolutely no money at all to do things like develop health centers, ensure education, local community safety, rebuild roads, so on, so forth throughout the conflict. And people have earned legitimacy within their communities and within powerful national subgroups. And one of the things that the crisis group, my organization, has been pushing the UN on and others on is asking this question of who the stakeholders in peace are in the future in Yemen. I think that there is a strong risk that we focus very much, with all due deference to those present, on a political solution that simply involves the party recognized by the international community and the most powerful military actor on the ground. First, by discounting additional military players on the ground, but also those people who can bring this positive local grassroots piece in. But their voices and their agendas, their priorities also have to be heard if they're going to buy in to that national political settlement. And certainly up till now, one of the challenges has been first getting people to buy into this idea internationally. We're always in a rush to quote unquote end the war at any cost, which is a valuable thing to do, but there's a very big difference between stopping the shooting and building peace and building governance. Sorry if I spoke at too much length.
No, thank you.
I'd love
And
to
I
hear
hope that
Amal's thoughts.
answers your question, at least partially. Before I go on to you, Amal, to talk to us about the currency devaluation, I'd like to hear your question.
Thank you, Peter Davies, Swedish Special Envoy for the conflict in Yemen. I'm very happy to be able to be here as a warm-up for the presentation of the report that you're also going to have in Stockholm in a couple of days. And we're very grateful, obviously, to the UNDP for choosing Stockholm as one venue for the launch of this report. I think you will find a lot of interest from many people in Stockholm. I wanted to ask a question actually that's related to the one that Peter just answered. I visited Yemen. I accompanied the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs.
This is different. I accompanied the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs to Yemen for the second time earlier this year. We visited this time Hadramaut, which is a very specific part of Yemen, and I was a little bit taken aback by the conversations that we had with the regional authorities there. That they told us, look here, we're doing our things well. What concern is it for us? What happens in the rest of the country? Please engage with us, and things will be fine. So I'd like to ask you about the possibilities and pitfalls of engaging in peace building at the sub-national level, like as the authorities ask for there. I would also like to ask the panel for one piece that has been missing in Yemen is regional integration. The Gulf Cooperation Council did a little bit in the past. Then the Gulf Cooperation Council became rather inoperative. We're having some discussions with them about what they can do. If you could say a little bit about what your wish list and recommendations would be to the Gulf Cooperation Council in terms of building peace in Yemen, because that is the regional organization that most naturally offers itself for this purpose.
Thank you for that. I'm going to give the first half of your question to Peter and the second half to Auka. But first, Amal, can you tell us about the currency devaluation and the difference between the North and the South?
Yeah, thank you, or thanks for the question and bringing up the very subject that is on the mind of many people working on Yemen nowadays. To be honest, it's a very complicated or a complex situation. It is not just a crisis of monetary policy, but also a crisis of politics right now in Yemen, because you have like almost absolutely no dialogue between the two central banks in the country, or like the authorities dictating monetary policy in the country. And the ones that are suffering from this are average citizens. And we have seen that the disparity between the exchange rates in the south and the north, they have reached levels that are like unfathomable by many people. Almost the exchange rate in the south is 3 times the exchange rate in the north. And this poses a huge burden on people in the south, and especially carries also inflation into the north. It's not like the north is not completely protected from these developments. In order for mitigating the effects of the devaluation of the currency or what the international community or stakeholders, donor countries can do to help stop the deterioration of the local currency. We can argue about countries depositing foreign currency in the Central Bank of Yemen. This would be an immediate policy that will help curb this deterioration of the local currency value, but it requires also a great deal of monitoring, transparency from the side of the implementing central bank. We can also advocate for easing restrictions on remittances coming from especially Gulf countries. You have a large Yemeni diaspora in Gulf countries that have been more or less restricted in their ability to send money, which is foreign currency, into Yemen that can help preserve some of the value of the local currency in the country. There are projects right now to provide technical assistance and capacity building to the Central Bank of Yemen. We can build on these projects and expand the scope of such technical assistance of the Central Bank. They badly need this support from international donors to know how to implement and carry out operations that can preserve the value of the currency. On the other hand, when we're talking about a crisis of politics, local authorities, whether government or different militias, they have to come into a dialogue together and figure out a way of limiting the power of brokers that are driving the value of the local currency down, because latest information that I have indicate that almost more than half of the operations carried out in the market are with the aim of currency or aiming to gain profits via currency arbitrage operations. So we know it's not like a normal market activity. You have actors that are actively working on making gains from this devaluation of the local currency, and they push the value further down, and you have a political responsibility to try to control the market. And this will only happen via dialogue between all the authorities on the ground in Yemen, whether in the south, in the north, and yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a really thorough answer. Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to the Swedish envoy's question. First to you, Peter. What can be done on a subnational level?
Well, I think yeah.
Which one did you?
Yeah, he asked about the pitfalls and benefits of local interaction. I mean, there are two arguments fundamentally about this. You've got those made by many people at the local level, which is that in effect they've been governing more or less solo, and there's some truth to that, although it's not the entire truth throughout the conflict. And in places like Hadramaut, which haven't been on the front line of the conflict, they face different challenges, and there are groups certainly within Hadramaut who would like to see the governorate operate largely autonomously from the rest of the country, be it under federalism or whatever else. And I think there is a counter-argument that comes from some on the side of the government, which is if international donors, diplomats, so on, so forth, start working directly with these local authorities, they are undermining national institutions. I think that maybe the question we need to be asking is, where is the missing connective tissue between those who operate on the ground and those who operate within state institutions? And I think one of the things that sort of with Chatham House colleagues, I sort of worked on a lot a few years ago in both Yemen and Iraq, was this question of the local capacity of people who do things on the ground, the people who should be doing things and wear suits and represent institutions. And there's that connective tissue between the two. And one of the things the war does is really erode that piece. So going out and finding the people who can work between them and building that capacity, I think is important, but at the same time fundamentally important also to sustain institutions at the local level, particularly, honestly, in a political context where we do not know what the future holds for people who represent institutions, even if they don't have institutional capacity around them. On regional integration, really, really quickly, we hear a lot about how the international community, quote unquote, is unified around Yemen, but there's a big difference between the P5 UN member states coming together and saying we definitely support the envoy in his efforts to develop a peace process of some kind, when in reality there is a lot of fiddling in the margins around what that might mean, a lot of resistance to some of what an envoy may or may not do. And I would say regionally and internationally, we do need much greater coordination and cooperation with the Office of the Special Envoy and others. So there is a collective international vision for peace and a sense of what is achievable in the short to medium term, rather than these very, very general statements that often actually are just masking these tensions with any effort to move beyond the accepted 7-year-old paradigm, which frankly, from my point of view, no longer works. Sorry if that was a bit too much.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. I'm going to go on to you, Auke. Before I want to hear from all of you on your thoughts on the report to end this discussion. But before that, your wish list to the GCC.
Well, let me just pick up on one comment on sort of the local authority side, because it is clear, of course, that we have a fragmentation of governance and governing authorities. And therefore, a lot of the service delivery and economic activities have also gone down to lower levels at the moment, which is really important to keep going, obviously, given the state of affairs in Yemen. And, I firmly believe also that local government and local governance as such will play an important role in the future of Yemen as a viable country and state. So therefore, it could serve as a platform also for a future peace settlement, and sort of build from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down. I mean, that's also a way of looking at it. When it comes to sort of the regional institutions, I think it's not only a question of the GCC or any other institution. I think regional cooperation on Yemen is going to be, I think, extremely important. And I will just give you the example of our floating bomb in Hodeidah, right? Our FSO Safar. I mean, this is a very difficult situation at the moment, and even if we find a solution for dealing with the salvage of the oil and the tanker as such, or in the catastrophic event of an oil spill, regional cooperation in the Red Sea is going to be extremely important. And we all remember, of course, when this containerized vessel got stuck in the Suez Canal and what it did to global trade and the damage it has caused. So I think there should also be a bit more cause for alarm in the regional countries and beyond to say, okay, we need to find a solution, but also in terms of contingency planning in case this happens, because it could be even tomorrow. How do we work together to clean this up in the most efficient manner? Because this can have huge ramifications, not only for Yemen as a country, which is already so hard hit anyhow, but even in terms of damage to international trade and so on, it could be absolutely enormous. So I really agree with your point. I just say that, look, we should look beyond just the politics of it, but looking at all aspects of regional cooperation. I mean, I also just want to highlight, for example, this is just another sort of rabbit hole a little bit, but look about illegal fishing in Yemen. Yemen has more than 2,000 kilometers of shoreline. Fishing is an important economic activity in Yemen, but how much fish has actually been stolen from Yemen, nobody knows, And I think in sort of the international context here is also an important element to look at. So there is a lot of ungained what do you call it, a lot of territory that we need to cover in that context as well, and that's not happening at the moment.
So really briefly, Peter, your thoughts on the report?
Can I hand to Amal first?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead,
I've spoken a lot, and I would love to hear more from her.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Jonathan and Tyler and the rest of the team for this report. Insightful information and everything, but to me, the best thing about the report is it, even as a person who's Yemeni, working on Yemen for a number of years, it allowed me to imagine a better future for the country. Mm-hmm. And I know that reality is really harsh, and it portrays a very bleak image into the future, but such a report gives me, even as a Yemen expert, the opportunity to imagine a better future for the country. So thank you for that. The way to this better future is going to be extremely difficult, but it's still achievable, doable, if we put enough effort and energy and focus into it. I also want to highlight, not just because I'm a woman, but also because I have worked and still work on women-related issues within the economic context, is that it also focuses on women in the economy. Until recently, I have noticed that whenever we talk about women inclusion in Yemen, it is always political or on the level of civil society and so on. So I have actively tried for the past year to go everywhere and advocate for more energy and funding and work and time working on women in the economy. So this could be a good start to advocate even more for that. And one last thing is, I think the issue of good governance and to include it in the report is very important, not just for Yemen, because the whole region is suffering from good governance challenges, and Yemen is no exception. It's not something that only Yemen is suffering from, but the whole region needs a better outlook into good governance, and for us to think about that within the Yemeni context is extremely important and vital for imagining this better reality. So these are my 2 cents about the report, and thanks again.
Peter.
Thank you. And now I've had a moment to quickly think. I've appreciated all three of the reports, and I'd like to commend UNDP and Jonathan for this incredible work. I think one of the things some of us have been saying for some time on Yemen is that we can no longer consider the best case scenario, and we have to start talking about the least bad outcome. I think one of the fantastic things this report provides us with is a sense of what that least bad outcome would look like and how it compares to allowing this conflict to continue for another 7 or 8 years and leading us to this point where we have 1.3 million people dying directly and indirectly. And I think that's such a useful thing for me in advocacy around conflict prevention and resolution to be able to bring to the table with people. And I'd just like to second the point very, very quickly that it's so exciting and so important to see also that one of the things that it's put up there, not as kind of an afterthought in a subsection at the end, is women's inclusion, but it's right up there, and that you've got the statistical proofs saying this is what we get if we actually pay attention to this issue, because ironically, what we've seen in Yemen is we've moved from a national dialogue conference, an effort to return to the outcomes of the National Dialogue Conference at the beginning of the war, which is highly inclusionary, to a political process, frankly, led by an international community, and a political context, including among Yemeni elites, which is among the most exclusionary in the world. And that among the many sins of this conflict is maybe among the most unforgivable. So I'd like to commend you again for making the point that there are statistical arguments that can be brought to the table, which policymakers, as we know, like very much.
Thank you so much. Before I hand over completely to you, Auke, I want to thank Peter Salisbury and Amal Nasser for being here today and helping us dissect this report and understand it better. So thank you both so much. And then I'm going to hand over to you to tell us what you think about the report and also to introduce the film that we're going to be watching. But we can step off the stage. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, and thank you, Nawal. I mean, on the report itself, just a couple of things. One, of course, the message is very clear. The war has to stop now. The costs of the war are just unacceptable high. And if we project it into 2030, it's just getting beyond imagination. I think the second point is really the message about hope. right? If the war can stop, there is a lot we can do as an international community to give back dignity to the Yemeni people and get back on that development trajectories as it was before the war, and even can beat it, right? So that message of hope is really important, because that's exactly what Yemen needs at the moment, other than the war to stop as such. I think I won't belabor the point of gender, because I think it's been very powerful, be made by both speakers before me on that. So I'll just rest there. I have also the honor to introduce a very short clip of a film. So please don't go yet. We will turn off the lights and show this clip to you. But let me just say a few words about what you have in your seats, which is this, right? So this is a small bag. It's actually made in Yemen, so we brought it all the way here. And secondly, what's in there, it's not a Christmas gift yet, but kind of. This is a bag of coffee from Yemen, right? Now, why coffee? Now, in my mind, you know, coffee also stands for the rich culture and history of Yemen, right? Coffee is well known. In fact, Yemen is known as the cradle of coffee. Yeah? So if you wonder where the word mocha or mocha in English comes from, it's a port city in Yemen that was the first city to export coffee to the world. And, you know, I also found out that it made me somehow a little bit happy is that, you know, the Dutch, in fact, in 1708, you know, built the first coffee factory in Mocha. You know, it's a long time ago. So it's very interesting. So this really for us is a very symbolic thing. And also it stands for the revival of Yemen as such. You know, Yemeni coffee is also going through a revival. It used to be the key export product for a long time. And now we see more and more young Yemenis exporting premium Yemeni coffee to the world. In fact, this has come from a Yemeni coffee shop just in Brooklyn out of here. So, you know, it's back on, right? And we really hope that that will also be the future for Yemen itself, so following the example of coffee as such. So we really hope you will enjoy this product of Yemen. Now, making the switch to the film, you will see is just 3 minutes, so don't worry, we will not keep you for long, but just to tell you that we're working on a longer documentary for which this is the trailer. And this trailer, or the documentary, is taking you through a journey through Yemen, sort of from place to place, showing the cultural richness and history and, you know, key things that make Yemen so famous in terms of the coffee, the honey, and all this sort of thing. So we'll show the documentary at another stage, but we didn't want to keep you from seeing this, you know, this trailer that really highlights the beauty of Yemen. I really hopefully entice you one day when peace has come to Yemen to undertake like a tourist visit to Yemen and really enjoy the people and the country itself. So if you can switch off the lights and show the movie, thank you very much.
This is Yemen, The land of the two gardens, a treasure trove of history.
Today, because it's a reminder of what we're all here fighting for. You know, Yemen is such a beautiful country with beautiful people, and that's why it's so important to take action. I have a little girl myself, and when I watch that video, it makes me really sad that I may not be able to take her back to where she actually comes from to see the beauty of her country. And, you know, we've spoken about this today, but it's so important for her, for Selma, for all the children of Yemen, Yemen's next generation, for all of us to collectively take action. We're so lucky today to have Dr. Khalida Bouzar, who is the UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP's Assistant Administrator, who will be closing the event. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a privilege to moderate this event, and welcome, Dr. Khalida.
Thank you very much. Auke was saying we need to think out of the box. If you allow me, Auke, I will speak out of the box. I have a statement, but I will not read it. Let me share with you what I was collecting from what was said today. We heard that Yemen needs support of everybody. Advocacy by all is needed. It's not about UNDP, it's about the international community, the regional community, and the Yemeni themselves. We heard that peace is key to development, and we often have sometimes also we can make the mistake to think that humanitarian aid can solve everything and can be a key to sustainable development. But we know that human capital is essential to recovery. That women, it's a man-made crisis, but we hope that women can help to solve the crisis. We heard that 6% of the women only are working, and Nawal, was saying that these numbers are old, so it's even worse. 50% of the Yemeni population is women, so we need to give them a chance to empower them, and it's not because I'm a woman, obviously, and an Arab woman. I also wanted to say about, again, on peace and development, that we need to integrate development into humanitarian from the beginning. We cannot detach them and fragment between humanitarian and development. We heard that from Auke, if I remember, that despite the humanitarian support, humanitarian needs are not decreasing. So is the solution humanitarian aid alone? The answer is no. We think we need to have development and to think on the long term where we try to patch the urgency and the emergency needs. Sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. Obviously, what we have heard, and this was from the representative of Sweden, we cannot wait for peace to think about development. And Auke was saying, I'm quoting you, Yemen is not only a humanitarian crisis, but also a development crisis. And I would like to add, development is a right for all. So let us make sure that everybody enjoys this right. Sorry, I have not finished. On the study, I mean, we heard that fragmentation is not an issue. We need an integrated recovery. And we have experience beyond Yemen. I was thinking about Iraq, listening to you, where we had stabilization facility that was built on an integrated manner, where we were able to bring back to their land 4.8 million IDP. So this is I'm not saying the study was done empirically, but we have the experience. On the affordability, and this is something that sometimes we think big, but sometimes small is beautiful, and we can make a difference. We can just grasp the low-hanging fruit. And Auke was saying something very, very important. It's not about food availability, it's about food affordability. So we can do something about it if we join forces. but we need to think out of the box, and we need to broaden the partnership basis, not only to think about the IFI, but also the insurance, as you were mentioning in London, for example, without repeating your comment about that. We also heard about the role of local communities and civil society. It's very important. I have the experience working in other countries without naming them, who doesn't have a real government. Working with local community helps a lot to build the resilience, to influence, and also to bring local democracy on the ground. So I think it's very important as a UN, but also as an international community, we help and give them a voice to contribute to the peace of their countries. But we also heard that we need to establish a link between local and national institutions. Even if they are weak, we need to make sure we don't speak only and address the local communities and civil society at the local level, but we also need to look at the national institution and to fill the gap between the two. We need, we've heard, I think, from one of the panelists, he was saying, Yemen has been receiving a lot of support, unlike other countries that I will not name from the region, which are facing a crisis. But what we've heard, and I fully agree with that, it's good to make general statements saying we are here, we support Yemen, but time has come to more action on the ground, and I think we owe that to the beautiful people of Yemen. I'm not saying that because you are from Yemen, but I think it's very important. So just to conclude, to come back to my statement, otherwise my colleagues will be upset, but this report is the last one, but it's not an end by itself. I think it's important to take note, and it's our role as UNDP, as a thought leader, to bring this issue in the forefront with you, but also with the media community, which is equally important. I think we have said already that since the first report, Yemen can't wait, but hopefully we should not lose any more time. In UNDP, we have already developed a nationwide renewable energy mixed investment plan. We are working with other promising sectors. We heard about coffee. By the way, okay, the bag says honey and the content was coffee, so you fooled us here. We also work on sustainable water resource management, and it's a big issue, not only in Yemen, but in many other countries in the region. Climate change is also another challenge that is affecting also agriculture productivity and production. With that, to conclude, I would like to also say that we have taken already the report's finding into practice, into action, as we are exploring ways to promote the involvement of the Yemeni private sector. It was not mentioned very much, but sustainable development needs private sector involvement, not only the government and civil society. And we are working with the private sector of Yemen, but also with the diaspora. You mentioned diaspora in Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere. It's really vital to addressing socioeconomic challenges, and as such contribute to stability, because we talk about building peace, but peace has to be maintained and has to be sustained, and hopefully, inshallah, we will reach peace, but we should avoid any risk for falling back into conflict. So with that, let me conclude by thanking you all who were resilient and stayed throughout. I would like to take advantage to thank you, but also to thank the panelists, and if I may, thank my team, Auke, who is an example of resilience with his team. Thank you very much. And with this, I just want to really last word to say that we have seen this movie showing beautiful Yemen, but we owe to the beautiful population and people of Yemen to send them a message of hope. Thank you very much.